In the 15th century, to gaze into a dark, music, boundless ocean was to confront the abyss. No maps, no GPS, no certainty of return. A slight miscalculation by a few degrees, and you could drift for weeks. If the wind died, the sun would claim you. Sail too far, and the sea itself might swallow you into horizons that never led home. The ocean was an enigma. For centuries, these waters acted as barriers, keeping the world confined. Yet within a single century, those barriers transformed into thoroughfares. The Age of Discovery, spanning the early 1400s to the late 1600s, served as the Big Bang of globalization. It bridged continents, altered the fare on your table, reshaped cultures, and shifted the balance of power by permanently weaving the world's peoples into a unified global fabric. The instigators of this global transformation didn't begin at the top of the hierarchy. They were the most improbable catalysts. In the early 1400s, Europe wasn't the dominant global force it was destined to become. Beside the dazzling wealth of Ming China, the formidable Ottoman Empire, or the gold-rich kingdoms of West Africa, Europe was a fragmented, quarreling backwater. Yet they harbored an obsession. The world's riches traveled along the Silk Road. If you were European and desired Chinese silk or Indian gems, you depended on a vast overland network of camel caravans across Asia. By the time these goods reached the eastern Mediterranean, the powerful maritime republics of Venice and Genoa controlled the gateway. They sold these items to the rest of Europe at exorbitant markups. The ultimate treasure, spices, music, pepper, cinnamon, cloves, a single sack worth a fortune. To obtain them, you paid hefty cuts to Arab, Turkish, and Italian intermediaries. Meanwhile, at the continent's opposite edge, perched on the absolute fringe of the known world, lay the Kingdom of Portugal. Economically impoverished and geographically secluded, Portugal was squeezed between hostile Castile and the vast uncharted emptiness of the Atlantic. Blocked from eastward expansion and entirely excluded from the lucrative Mediterranean spice trade, desperation bred ambition. To survive and prosper, Portugal needed to discover its own source of gold. This slender strip of land became the launching pad that reshaped history. From Europe's edge, they resolved to attempt the unthinkable, harness the treacherous waters to extend their reach halfway across the globe. Portugal possessed another asset, political resolve. A royal prince named Henry, later dubbed the Navigator, became the propelling force behind a methodical fixation on the horizon. The year is 1415. Portugal seizes the North African port of Ceuta. Inside, they observe caravans from the deep Sahara laden with gold, and spices. They grasp that the continent's vast riches are entirely bypassing them. But for Henry, wealth was only part of the equation. Fueled by crusading zeal, he aimed to outmaneuver Eastern empires. It was the ultimate medieval cocktail, a convergence of religious fervor and raw avarice. Henry rarely sailed personally. Instead, he channeled resources into Lisbon's docks, procuring the finest maps and mathematical knowledge to circumvent the caravans and access the source directly. Yet a formidable psychological hurdle loomed. The Sea of Darkness. Mariners believed that beyond Cape Bojador, the ocean boiled and winds precluded return. In 1434, Captain Gil Eanes pushed past the fear and finally rounded the Cape. He demonstrated that the ocean didn't boil. He broke a barrier that had confined Europe for centuries. But returning home unveiled a new technical challenge. Traditional Mediterranean vessels were useless against the unrelenting southbound winds of the open Atlantic. The remedy? The caravel, light and shallow, fitted with triangular Arabian lateen sails. For the first time, European sailors could harness the wind at an angle and zigzag forward against it. Mastering the wind, they pioneered a daring tactic, the volte du mar. Rather than battling coastal headwinds, they sailed blindly into the open Atlantic, catching deep ocean currents that carried them safely back, to Lisbon. Yet deciphering the Atlantic took decades. Advancing southward, the Portuguese established fortified trading posts, a volatile blend of commerce and conflict, music, with African kingdoms. Here we encounter a somber and defining reality of this expansion. By 1444, the first documented shipment of enslaved Africans arrived in Portugal. This wasn't incidental to the Age of Discovery, it became its dark cornerstone. A stark truth that must be plainly stated: the sugar and gold soon flooding Europe were built on forced labor. Treating human lives as commodities financed music, their exploration, instituting a brutal system that would displace millions and inflict immeasurable suffering for centuries. In 1453, the Ottoman Empire shattered Constantinople. The traditional gateways to the east were choked, rendering the old overland routes impossibly perilous and costly. The slow Portuguese crawl down Africa abruptly morphed into a desperate, high-stakes race to reach the continent's bottom, bypassing the blockade to music, open a direct sea passage to India. But as voyages pushed deeper into the unknown, the harsh realities of survival took hold. Men slept drenched in salt water, surviving on rotting meat and slimy green water. Then came the silent killer, scurvy. Deprived of nutrients, the human body essentially unraveled. Gums blackened. Old scars mysteriously reopened into fresh wounds. Men faced their final moments in dark holds, hallucinating in agonizing pain. Yet while the crew decayed below deck, exploration above was a cold, calculating science. Captains employed astrolabes to gauge latitude, but they had a blind spot, absolutely no means to measure longitude. To navigate the east-west void, they depended on dead reckoning, observing the rushing foam, estimating the ship's speed, and combining it with an hourglass and compass to chart their music existence on a blank map. It was an incredibly perilous gamble. Every detail was recorded in classified manuals called roteiros, the 15th-century equivalent of nuclear codes, guarded by monarchs under the ultimate penalty, while foreign spies desperately sought to steal them in the shadows. The decisive turning point arrived in 1488. Captain Bartolomeu Diaz pushed farther south than any European had dared. A massive 13-day storm battered his fleet, dragging them blindly into the open ocean. When the sea finally calmed, Diaz steered east to locate the African coast. Nothing but water. Realizing the storm had blown him past the continent, he turned north. At last, land. The coastline now stretched northeast. He had succeeded. The storm had carried him completely around Africa's southern tip, proving the Atlantic and Indian Oceans were connected. On the return voyage, he finally spotted the massive rocky peninsula they had been blown past. He named it the Cabo das Tormentas, the Cape of Storms. But back in Lisbon, King John II instantly grasped the implication and renamed it the Cabo da Boa Esperança, the Cape of Good Hope. Because if you can round Africa, you can reach India. The sea route to Asia was now open. By 1492, a newly unified Spain watched Portugal's success with envy. Fresh from the Reconquista, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella were eager to compete for global riches. Enter a persistent and ambitious sailor named Christopher Columbus. His pitch was radical: forget the long route around Africa, reach Asia's spice market simply by sailing west, straight across the open Atlantic. But his entire proposal rested on a massive mathematical blunder. He gravely underestimated the Earth's size. He pitched Portugal first. They rejected him. Their geographers recognized his math was fatally flawed. No ship could carry enough provisions for an ocean that vast. He took his plan to Spain. Spanish scholars also deemed his numbers impossible. But Spain was losing the maritime race. Isabella and Ferdinand realized the ultimate prize was worth risking 3 small ships. They decided to bet on a math error. On August 3, 1492, Columbus set sail with 87 men, heading west into the void. Weeks passed with no land in sight. The relentless westbound wind filled the crew with dread. How would they ever sail back? Fear bred mutiny. they were sailing into a total emptiness. To manage the rising panic, Columbus cooked the books. He kept 2 logs, a true one and a fake one showing a shorter distance to conceal how far they truly traveled. On October 12, 1492, after over a month at sea, a lookout finally spotted land. Columbus stepped onto the Bahamas. He encountered the indigenous Taino people. Utterly convinced he had reached the outer islands of Asia, the Indies, he called them Indians. He was dead wrong. The world he had stumbled upon was entirely unknown to Europe, yet was already home to millions of people. His mathematical delusion had delivered him straight into the heart of the Americas. The Spanish immediately raised their royal standards, claiming the land. When Columbus spotted the Taino wearing gold ornaments, he saw the means, music, to fund his ultimate obsession, a holy crusade. Viewing the natives simultaneously music as souls to be converted and bodies to be exploited, the mission violently shifted to extraction. The Spanish instituted the encomienda system, a legal fiction that forced indigenous people into brutal, unpaid labor in mines and plantations. But the Europeans' most devastating music weapon was biological. Isolated for millennia, the Americas had zero genetic immunity to old-world microbes like smallpox and measles. European ships were essentially floating biohazards. The result was a demographic apocalypse. Within decades, entire civilizations collapsed, wiping out over half the native population in one of music history's most severe catastrophes. Yet this massive biological collision rewired the entire planet. Europeans brought horses, pigs, and deadly diseases to the Americas. In return, they took back potatoes, maize, and cassava. Historian Alfred Crosby famously coined music, a term for this, the Columbian exchange. These calorie-rich superfoods thrived where traditional grains failed. They triggered massive population surges across Europe and Africa, and eventually helped triple China's population. News of Columbus's voyage sparked an immediate crisis. Spain claimed they had found the shortcut to Asia. The Pope intervened, drawing a boundary line heavily favoring Spain. Portugal, furious at the threat to its hard-won monopoly, rejected the Pope's decree and prepared for war. To avert a catastrophic clash, the two rivals negotiated directly. In 1494, they signed the Treaty of Tordesillas, Tratado de Tordesillas. They took a map, music, and drew a vertical line straight down the globe's center. Everything to the west went to Spain. Everything to the east belonged to Portugal. With a single pen stroke, two European nations divided the entire earth between them, completely ignoring the millions who already lived there. Portugal knew Columbus had returned with some gold and foreign music, plants, but crucially, no spices. The true prize still waited around Africa. In July 1497, Vasco da Gama was sent to finish the job. Armed with highly classified roteros, he executed an insane maneuver, steering his ships entirely away from the coast, music, plunging deep into the South Atlantic void to catch the perfect winds. For 93 agonizing days and 10,000 kilometers, they saw absolutely nothing but water. After brutally battling currents for a month to round the Cape of Good Hope, they pushed up East Africa into waters entirely uncharted by Europeans. But they didn't find an empty sea. To their surprise, they stumbled into a highly sophisticated, bustling trade network connecting Africa, the Persian Gulf, and India. Securing a local pilot in modern-day Kenya, da Gama crossed the Arabian Sea. On May 20, 1498, music, his anchors dropped in Calicut, India. The impossible was done. He had finally reached India by sea. The meeting with the local ruler was a profound cultural shock. Da Gama presented his gifts, striped cloth, brass basins, and honey. To a society trading in diamonds and fine silk, it was a joke. The wealthy merchants mocked the Portuguese as little more than unwashed pirates. Departing under severe hostility, music, da Gama managed to buy a small cargo of spices with gold. But the return voyage was a nightmare. Ignoring local warnings, he fought the Indian Ocean winds. Sickness wiped out half his crew, including his own brother. He was forced to burn one of his ships because there simply weren't enough living men left to sail it. In September 1499, he limped back into Lisbon. The sheer human toll was staggering. Of the 170 men who set sail, only 55 survived. The small cargo of spices he brought back sold for 60 times the cost of the entire expedition, proving the direct sea route to India was commercially viable. Soon after, Portuguese fleets crossed the Atlantic to claim Brazil. There they built a highly profitable sugar empire. As indigenous societies collapsed from disease, Portugal dramatically escalated the transatlantic slave trade to fuel it, condemning millions of human beings to grueling, shortened lives in the cane fields. Portugal realized a harsh truth: they couldn't compete in the East through trade. They had nothing Asia wanted. But they possessed one advantage: music. Their Atlantic-tested ships were floating fortresses armed with heavy bronze cannons. When they returned in 1502, it was not as humble merchants, but as conquerors. Using brutal naval artillery, they bombarded coastal cities, sank fleets, and forged a violent monopoly, imposing themselves on a world that had never invited them. While Portugal built its Eastern Empire, Spain transformed the Americas. Cortés toppled the Aztec Empire with 500 men. Pizarro shattered the Inca with fewer. The motive was always the same: extract wealth, above all silver. In 1545, Potosí's silver flooded the globe, crossing the Pacific on Manila galleons, trading directly with China, permanently wiring the Americas, Europe, Africa, and Asia together for the first time in history. The Catholic Church also followed this new global trade with its ideological invasion, Jesuits mapping souls the same way navigators mapped coastlines. And as the 16th century closed, new rivals crashed in. The Dutch built the VOC, history's first multinational corporation, and cracked Portugal's monopoly not with armies, but with a breach of trust. A Dutch insider published the classified Roteiros, handing the Indian Ocean to Northern Europe. The English planted the aggressive seeds of their empire in North America, Jamestown. The world entered a music new era. It was no longer just kings exploring the map, it was massive joint stock companies waging corporate wars and ruling empires across thousands of miles of ocean around the globe. The age of exploration ended, music, when the blank spaces on the map were filled. But the machine it set in motion never stopped. When you eat a tomato in Italy, you are tasting the legacy of the Columbian exchange. When you drink coffee from Brazil, it is part of a system built on land and labor seized by force. The borders of many nations, the languages, music, the religions, the food, the diseases, all were forged in the fires of this era. That is not a comfortable thought, music, and it shouldn't be. But the ordinary people who braved the unknown could never foresee the catastrophic and extraordinary consequences of their courage. For better or worse, we are the reality of a connected world that began 600 years ago.